Hi, I'm Wes Gollum, the Energy Geek. As you probably know, we feature homes that are net zero or have some unique energy or sustainability features to them. So far, all the homes we've featured have been, shall we say, terrestrial. Until now. Solar photovoltaics can be used where there is no power grid. Perhaps the first practical application of it was on Telstar, the early 60s satellite that inspired a hit song by the same name. It remains an excellent source of electricity when you live off the grid, like on a sailboat. So I'm here today with Daniel Paseltiner at his house,
Yeah.
on his boat. Hi, how are you
Hi,
doing today?
how are you, Wes? I'm pretty good. It's a great day. You guys picked an awesome day to come.
Thanks
check
for
out
having
the-
me. Tell us your story. Tell me about how you got there.
So, I spent 2 summers through hiking on the Appalachian Trail in 2017 and then the Pacific Crest Trail in 2018, and really just fell in love with that sort of lifestyle and living more simply and more closely to nature. And then after I'd finished up through hiking and needed to be in a city for work and school, was looking for a way to sort of be in the city for work and school, but then still have some sort of adventure and be exploring in nature. And I was also sort of missing time on the water because I'd sort of grown up kind of splitting my time between hiking and paddling and sailing. And so sort of the mixture of all of that tumbling around in my head, like, oh, well, maybe I could live on a sailboat. And so then last summer, in June of 2019, I bought a sailboat in Eastport, Maine, and sailed down the coast to Portland, and I've been living aboard Crescent ever since. She's a 1976 Pearson 10-meter. Yeah, I've been slowly repairing things and making modifications. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The solar panels are actually a fairly recent addition. The plan was always to put solar panels on the boat, but I didn't actually get the project done until now. I can't remember, maybe April or it might have been May of this year. And so initially last summer, out on the mooring, the only power source was just running the engine to charge the batteries with a 70 amp inverter. There's an inboard 20 horse diesel motor. That's really a great motor, but running the engine to charge the batteries is a lot of wear and tear on the engine. The inverter is not horribly efficient. It won't get the batteries all the way charged up. You maybe get to like 80% of your total capacity. And it's just loud and unpleasant, and it burns a lot of diesel. So it's really not a great system. Then over the winter, I kind of was able to get away because I was back in a slip for the winter, had shore power, so it was just plugged in, and that kept everything charged up all winter. So then coming back out to the mooring this summer, getting the solar panels done was a really high priority. Finding a place that's unshaded for solar panels can be a real challenge because you've got the mast and the rigging and the boom, and there's all this stuff that's going to cast shadows. And so one of the best spots to put them on a sailboat is over the cockpit, or you'll see other boats that sort of build these wings to support the panels outside the stern rail. But the other thing with the solar panels is that the boat didn't come with a bimini, which is sort of that canvas cover awning that goes over a cockpit. And so I was trying to kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone by putting the solar panels above the cockpit to get some shade, and then also conveniently that puts them in a pretty unshaded area, which is good for collecting energy. So the first step was to build this stern rail. So I bought a whole bunch of tubing and actually bent the stern rail myself. You can see the corners aren't quite perfect. They got a little bit kinked. But it worked. The stern rail's there. And then I built the frame up and over, and then went down to Massachusetts and picked up these 2 solar panels. They're each 325 watt. They're made by a company called Q Solar. And what's neat about them is typically, at least in broad strokes, a whole solar panel is made up of individual solar cells, and those are all then wired in series. A problem with that design is that because all the individual solar cells are wired in series, is that if you have shading on just one of those individual cells, you dramatically drop the output of the whole panel. So what's cool about these panels is that instead of having them all this, and you can kind of see on the underside because we can see the individual cells.
Are those micro inverters? The black?
They're whatever. I'm not actually those. You're talking about those little black boxes. It's whatever the stuff is to run the panels. I'm not actually sure, but you can see how the panels are basically broken into two halves. And what they've done is they've wired the cells on each half of the solar panel in series, and then wired the two halves in parallel. And that makes them a little bit more robust against shading, because it means if there's shading on just one half of the panel, then the other half is unaffected. And then I have two panels, and so typically on a lot of larger solar installations, the solar panels will be wired in they'll be wired in series to boost the total output voltage. So these panels are 24 volt nominal. So if you're going to charge like a 24 volt DC system or a 48 volt DC system, you have to wire the panels in series in order to get up to a high enough voltage to be able to charge those batteries. But on this boat, it's just a small 12 volt system. So the fact that each panel was nominally 24 volts to begin with, that was a way higher voltage than necessary. So what I did was I wired the two panels in parallel instead of in series, and so that makes the whole system even more robust to shading. So if you think about the whole array, you've got the two separate panels, and then each of those panels, each half operates independently because they're internally wired in parallel. So by putting the two panels in parallel, it basically means that each quarter of my solar array can operate independently of the other three quarters. And so it just makes the whole array much more robust against shading, so that if there's just shading because of the mast or the rigging on only one section of one solar panel, the other three quarters can operate at 100%. So that was the strategy in it. And I guess in terms of choosing how many panels and how big they should be, what the capacity is, honestly, I knew I didn't need a whole lot of solar capacity for the system, and I was more interested in just covering the whole cockpit to get as much shading as possible. So the two 325 watt panels, gives total of 650 watts, and that's way, way more capacity than is needed for this system. But the benefit is that the batteries are always charged. Honestly, the panels have gotten pretty cheap, so it was about $400 to get both of them, but they're basically guaranteed to 90% of their original output for the next 20 years or something like that. So, over their lifetime, it's not that big of an investment.
So you're getting all of your power when you're at anchor for the summer?
Yeah, everything.
And tell me about what you were saying before we started about the inverter.
Yeah, so after I got the solar panels up, I installed the 700 watt DC to AC inverter. And mostly we've just used that for charging laptops and charging batteries for power tools. In principle, you can run any AC appliance off of it that doesn't need more than 700 watts. And that's just made life a lot easier to be able to charge laptops pretty easily on the boat. Everything else is all 12 volts. So all the lighting inside are all 12 volt LEDs. In terms of other major things that use power right now, the other big thing beyond just the lighting would be the water pump, because there's pressure water on the boat. And then also, there are two diesel heating systems on board. There's one that's just a drip fireplace, and that really doesn't use any electricity. But then there's another forced air diesel heating system that, when it's running, needs 12 volt DC as well to run the fuel pump for the system, and then run a fan that blows hot air through some ducting that I've run through the boat, and then blows hot air out 2 vents inside the boat.
You were just installing that when I was here last year, right?
I think when you were here last year, I was just installing the fireplace. The separate forced air diesel heater I didn't install until close to the end of this winter.
And tell me about the winter. How was it?
The winter went really well. Going into it, I was definitely a little bit nervous, but fortunately over at Damila's Marina, there's a pretty good liveaboard community and a lot of people who have done this for several winters. And I was able to get some good help. For most of the winter, I was fine with just the diesel fireplace, and then I had a little electric space heater, and I was able to run that over the winter because I was plugged into shore power. And so there's actually, this is pretty common, but there's an outlet inside the main cabin that will give you, it basically runs just an extension cord from where you plug the shore power into the stern of the boat, so you have just regular 120 volt access right in your cabin. So in the boat, there are basically 2 AC outlets. There's one that's shore power, so if you are connected to shore power, you can plug into that. And then there's another outlet, and that's what the inverter powers. And that got through the winter in terms of heating. Then the reason I wanted to get the forced air heater going, this is really moving away from the solar panels, but the diesel fireplace is really great, but the problem is that it is a natural draft system, so it has a chimney just coming out of the boat, and in the sheltered marina it worked pretty well, but once we got out here to the mooring, things were much more open. If there's basically any more breeze than this, especially when it gets really windy, it really struggles to maintain a good draft. And we had several sort of backdrafts and got lots of soot in the cabin. And it's even worse because it burns diesel, and diesel fumes are just awful. It's not like wood smoke, which is sort of makes you choke but doesn't smell bad. The diesel fumes are really noxious. And so the benefit of the forced air diesel system is, in terms of efficiency, they actually work out to be about the same. And basically the way it works is that it has, I put a through hull in the stern for the exhaust, and so it draws in air. You can actually see it. The heater's right in here. It's this guy.
That's the heater, the red thing?
Yeah, that's the heater there. And so it draws in combustion air just from inside this locker. And I could take it apart, but basically there's just a large, I think it's an aluminum block. It basically functions like a heat sink. So it draws in combustion air from this locker, burns diesel using that air, and then sends the exhaust right out the stern of the boat through this exhaust tube here. That combustion heats up the heat sink inside of it, and then it draws, there's sort of a separate air loop that draws in fresh air from this locker as well, pulls it across the hot heat sink to heat the air, and then it blows that hot air through this duct here, which then runs into the boat, and basically this ducting extends pretty much all the way up to the bow, or almost all the way up to the bow, and there are 2 vents that it blows the hot air out of. So there are a few advantages to that system.
It's out here and you don't get the fumes.
Well, right, so that's the major thing, is that it has a forced exhaust, and the exhaust I put on the stern of the boat. And so on a mooring, boats always orient bow into the wind, so you know your exhaust is always going to be blown away from the boat, which is really great, but also because it has a forced exhaust, meaning like there's a fan pushing the air out of the system, it's not really affected by weather. So even when it's really rough out here, it still runs no problem. The other real benefit to it, well, there are a couple, but the next major one is just because of sort of how the installation for the diesel fireplace worked, I couldn't put it all the way low in the boat. So basically it does a really good job heating the boat from sort of your waist up. And you could be like, I spent a lot of the winter wearing sweatpants and slippers and a t-shirt because the floor of the boat would be really cold, and the, up in the sort of top half of the space would be really warm. And I tried a couple different options with, fans, and I tried sort of putting a hose on the bottom of the fireplace to make it draw air from the bottom of the boat, and none of it really worked. I'm sure there's somebody who could probably come up with a better system. The benefit on a slightly larger boat is that there would have been space to basically mount it, the fireplace, right on the floor, which I think would have really helped. But
No fan, no way to have a fan blowing down.
I tried that, and it really wasn't working. But the nice thing about the diesel heater is that I got to run the ducting wherever I want. So the vent for the main cabin is basically as low as possible. So it blows air right along the floor, and that leads to the boat heating much more evenly. Then the other problem with the fireplace is that it would heat the main cabin really well, but I sleep up in the bow, and the air wouldn't really circulate up there well. Once you got into your covers and warmed up, it was fine, but it meant that it wasn't a really pleasant place to just be hanging out during the winter. And so the second vent from this diesel heater blows right into the V-berth, and that also made a huge difference.
And it does.
there.
You've been
Yeah,
had cold weather since you installed it. Is what I mean.
30 degrees, 20 degrees.
Yeah.
This will heat the boat by itself, no problem. The other benefit is that it, in principle, at least has a thermostatic control. So you can sort of create a set point and then it will regulate itself. In practice, I don't know that feature's worked very well, and I've really just been sort of adjusting it manually. In terms of efficiency, it's about the same as the fireplace. It burns about a gallon of diesel for a full day to heat the boat. It's maybe a little bit more efficient, but not terribly. The real downside is that it's just more complex. There's more. So that was the big deal, is that it requires electricity. So until having the solar panels, it really wasn't great, because it meant that it runs a fuel pump and a fan, and then there's also an electronic little LCD control screen, and so it draws off the batteries to power all of that. And until the solar panels, we didn't have a way to charge the batteries out here, and so we're running the engine to keep the charge. Oh, excuse me, it also has a glow plug. That's how it burns the diesel. It initially gets itself hot enough with a glow plug, and that also runs. And that draws a lot. That'll, on the 12-volt system, once initially starting, it'll draw between 10 and 12 amps to initially get hot. But now that we have the solar panels, I really think it's probably a better system than the fireplace. The advantage of the fireplace is there's not really anything to break. I intentionally set the fireplace up with a gravity feed tank, so I can, with a transfer pump, I can transfer diesel from the main tank on the boat, which is a 20-gallon diesel tank, to it's either a 2.5 or 3-gallon tank that's above the fireplace. And so once that's filled, the diesel fireplace can run totally without electricity, which I really cared about, especially over the winter at the marina, because I was concerned about losing shore power in a storm. And we did lose it a couple times overnight for short periods of time, but it would have sort of really sucked to be relying just on an electric heater and have the shore power go out. There, you can see Portland Head now. Yeah.
And what's that called again?
Fort Gorgeous. It's never fired a shot.
Not only does Daniel produce all his electricity from photovoltaics, since the wind is caused by the sun, his transportation is solar powered too. Daniel's solar installation has provided all the power he and his girlfriend have needed to live aboard Crescent. Daniel has recently applied to medical school. He is hoping to get into a program in Boston. If he gets in, he plans to sail to Boston and live aboard Crescent while he's going to medical school.
Really just fell in love with that sort of lifestyle and living more simply and more closely to nature. Some sort of adventure and be exploring. Like, oh, well, maybe I could live on a sailboat.